I'm really excited to be hosting today's discussion on the role for the financial sector in net zero in the UK and Germany. From an E3, oh God, that's very loud, isn't it? From an E3G perspective, there's nothing more important to delivering net zero than rapidly scaling up finance for clean energy solutions across the world. And the financial sector will play a critical part in delivering that. I would also say that tackling climate change is one of a very personal issue to me because I cannot handle it getting hotter as a Scottish person. I think as we can all recognise in this room, green finance is one of the biggest growth sectors we expect for the next couple of years. And demand for net zero is growing across the private sector, with initiatives like the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero now representing around 40% of global AUM. However, I think it's not all rosy at the moment. The ongoing cost of living crisis really has highlighted the need to properly scale up investment towards clean energy solutions. And leveraging in private investment for net zero hasn't yet happened. So I think we really need to see a development on the existing package of market signals we have to really accelerate that process. To explore this, I'm really excited to be joined by two fantastic speakers today, Elisabeth Stheeman and Dr. Harald Heubaum, and to discuss the role for the finance community's participation in net zero. Now, Elisabeth Stheeman is an external member of the Bank of England's Financial Policy Committee and Financial Market Infrastructure Board. She's also been a member of the Supervisory Board of Aareal Bank AG, as well as the Deputy Chair of the Risk Committee and a member of the Technology and Innovation Committee since 2015, amongst a number of other really impressive allegiances you've had. Whereas Dr. Harald Heubaum is a senior lecturer in global energy and climate policy at the SOAS Centre for International Studies and Diplomacy, and also deputy director and co-founder for the SOAS Centre for Sustainable Finance. So without further ado, we're going to hear some remarks from our panelists. So Elisabeth, I'm going to hand to you first, and then we'll come to you, Harald.
Thank you, Heather. And thanks again to the BGA and also to Ruffer for hosting this. It's great to be here and great to see you all here. So I don't need to tell you that climate change brings far-reaching economic, financial, and social consequences. Action to mitigate the associated risk and reach net zero needs to be taken without further delay. So as you heard, I'm an external member of the Bank of England's Financial Policy Committee, or the FPC for short, which looks at risks to stability of the UK financial system. Climate change is one of the sources of risk the FPC thinks about. It has been on the FPC's agenda for several years, initially from the perspective of assessing risks to insurers in the event of catastrophic climate events, and more recently also from the perspective of system-wide impacts of climate-related risks and from the pace and scale of the transition. As you heard, I'm also on the board of a number of UK and German companies, and I'm a fellow of Chapter Zero, which is the UK chapter of the Climate Governance Initiative, which provides a knowledge base for non-executive directors on climate issues. In addition, I'm an external member of the Audit and Risk Committee of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or AIIB, which gives me another lens on the challenges of climate change in Asia. Through these roles, I've seen firsthand how the transition to net zero economy has increasingly become a focus for all. And I've seen how the actions of the financial sector and regulators can support this transition. Today, I'm going to outline what the UK is doing to contribute to net zero. I'll focus on the financial aspects of this, and in particular what the Bank of England, the UK's financial regulator, is doing to ensure the UK's or the financial system is resilient to climate-related financial risks, and thereby ensuring it can support the transition to net zero. There's a lot of momentum, as you know, in the UK around reaching net zero. The UK government legislated for net zero by 2050, and the UK's Chancellor of the Exchequer announced that the UK aims to create the world's first net zero aligned financial system. As part of this, a task force has been put together to develop disclosure standards for transition plans and is due to report at the end of this year. the UK played a key role in the establishment of the UN Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, or GFANZ, they do love acronyms, initiative, which started ahead of COP26 in Glasgow last year. Commitments to net zero from these financial firms will help to fund the net zero transition. So to Heather's point about how is that all going to be financed, financial firms that are here tonight can also join this initiative. The UK has also been pushing forward with mandatory disclosures of climate-related financial information in line with the task force, and there comes another acronym, Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD. Some of you might have heard of it. There's a colleague of mine in the audience, Michael Sharon, who's very knowledgeable about this. From April this year, over 1,300 of the largest UK registered companies and financial institutions have had to start disclosing climate-related financial information on a mandatory basis. This includes many of the UK largest traded companies, banks and insurers, as well as private companies with over 500 employees and £500 million in turnover. The UK's Sustainable Finance Roadmap, published in October last year, set out the UK's approach to a sustainable disclosure regime with the International Sustainable Standards Board, the ISSB, standards as the core. The UK taxonomy, product labels, and disclosure of transition plans. The UK has been supportive of the creation of the ISSB to deliver a global baseline of disclosure standards, which the ISSB is now consulting on. Climate change and the transition to net zero can affect the safety and soundness of the firms the Bank of England regulates, the stability of the wider financial system, and the economic outlook. The Bank of England is helping to build resilience to climate-related financial risks, and in doing so is helping to support the transition to net zero. At the level of individual firms, in 2019, the Bank of England set supervisory expectations for banks and insurance companies to enhance their approaches to managing the financial risks from climate change. And from 2022, the bank now actively supervises firms against these expectations as part of the normal supervisory work. For financial firms to manage their climate-related financial risk well, for investors to allocate capital in a climate-efficient way, and for policymakers to design effective climate policy, a key dependency is the public disclosure of climate-related information by companies. So the Bank of England has been working to support the ongoing rollout of mandatory climate disclosure requirements across the UK by 2025 in line with the TCFD framework. The Bank of England is also working to understand the implications of climate change for monetary policy from both a macroeconomic perspective and through the bank's own market operations. The transition to net zero is a global challenge, so we have also been working with other central banks and regulators through the Network for Greening the Financial System, or NGFS. The NGFS, now over 100 members strong, has had a central role in establishing that climate change is a financial stability risk and has embarked on the task of integrating climate-related risk into supervision and financial stability monitoring. And finally, in order to better assess climate risks and their implications for financial stability, the FEC, jointly with the Bank's Prudential Regulation Committee, or PRC, has just published the results of its climate scenario exercise to assess the resilience of major UK banks, insurers, and the wider financial system to different climate scenarios. There are 3 different scenarios, all with a 30-year horizon. The first, where early policy action is taken for an orderly transition to net zero emissions. The second, where policy action is delayed and introduced more severely to compensate for lost time, leading to sharp and disorderly transition to net zero emissions. And finally, a third, where no additional policy action is put in place by governments, leading to a growing concentration of emissions in the atmosphere as a result, and a continued increase in global temperatures levels that exceed the goals set under the Paris Agreement. This was an excellent exercise. It helped to improve banks and insurance climate risk management, size the risk that participants in the exercise phase, and to better understand the potential response of banks and insurance to climate-related risks and their broader implications. To conclude, reaching net zero requires action by all the financial community, whether that be banks, insurers, or the financial regulators. The FEC is playing a key role in ensuring the financial system is resilient to climate-related financial risks, and therefore ensuring it can support the transition to net zero. This is an unprecedented challenge which will demand an equally unprecedented degree of cooperation today, tomorrow, and in the future. That is why sharing what we've learned, whether that be through publishing the climate scenario analysis results or through events like this, will help us all learn together and achieve our goals. So I'll hand back to Heather. Thanks very much.
Thank you a lot, Elisabeth. And I think just listening to that indicates quite how busy the UK's financial development is towards net zero. And anyone who's working on this in the room, I feel you. It's tiring. I'm now going to hand over to Harald. So Harald, do you want to offer us your perspective on the role for the financial sector in net zero?
Yes, thank you very much. I'll be talking about financial sector, but also policy frameworks more broadly. So not just looking at some of the issues that Elisabeth has already touched on, and the excellent background for the macro perspective that we already have now. I want to start with looking at the German example, the energy crisis and the cost of living crisis, which is hitting Germany just as bad as it is hitting the United Kingdom. And it's intermixed, of course, with the war in Ukraine, the Russian war in Ukraine. So it's a bit of a risk there that this narrative around supply security, around affordability and competitiveness, at the moment, with a shorter term, we hope shorter term discussion, is disrupting the climate and the environmental narrative. As much as though we say that we want to shift away from a dependence on Russian gas by supporting renewables and low carbon, there's this other debate that's currently happening that pushes climate into the background at times. We have a situation right now where Germany is worried about getting pushed deep into recession, especially given the Nord Stream 1 potential disruption. It's shut down now for scheduled maintenance, or has been for a couple of days, 10 days of supposedly scheduled maintenance. We don't know what's going to happen at the end of those 10 days. There may well be more of a disruption to come. And of course, government ministers are running a little scared in Germany at the moment. I think we see some of these more unedifying pictures and videos of our German, that is, Minister of Economics and Climate going to Qatar and elsewhere, effectively begging for more gas to be delivered to Germany. And the Greens in the German government now having to support the reactivation of mothballed coal-fired power stations. Now, that's a temporary measure. We're not talking about investing in a whole new fleet of coal-fired power stations, but it is not good from a climate perspective, right? So there's a clash of some of these goals that Germany's grappling with, and that a number of other countries are also grappling with. So that's the disruption of this narrative and the problems we're facing at the moment. I think Elisabeth has made very clear that it's an urgent challenge. We need to do a lot more quickly. And having these potential years of disruption are a challenge. The second point is, from my perspective, is the scale of the transition. We tend to talk about, and I think that was in the title as well, the energy transition, but really it's a systems transition. We have tended to focus in the early years of the energy transition on the power sector, building more nameplate capacity, wind farms and solar parks and geothermal where that works, and maybe biomass. But now we need to start thinking more about, and we have for a number of years, all these other parts of the system, transportation and storage and energy efficiency, where we're really not very effective, unfortunately, around transmission grids, investing in high voltage transmission lines, interconnection, all these things that need to be thought together for this transition to work. And also something that we often don't do because we don't think about adaptation when we think about energy transitions, but adapting the energy system and other systems and looking at resilience of the financial system and other systems is key to this transition too. And we're not doing nearly enough on adaptation in terms of the amount of money that's invested and the rules and regulations that we set. The German government has a goal of quadrupling solar PV rooftop installations by 2030 or just before 2030, and having 80% of all of its electricity generated from renewables before 2030. If you want that, and you also want hydrogen, which is on vogue at the moment, in Germany as much as it is in the UK, you will have to more than double the output of your power sector at the moment, the electricity that you need to actually produce, because green hydrogen, maybe we can talk about this later if some of you have an interest in this particular issue, requires insane amounts of electricity. That's why 0.1% or 0.2% of all the hydrogen currently produced is green hydrogen, that is electrolysis using renewable power. Most of it comes from coal and methane, so it's a very dirty process. But if you want to do that, you have to build out your power system. You want to electrify transport, you want to electrify heating, you have to do that. But you also have to go into all these other areas and intervene, policy intervention, and mobilize finance and investment into these. So those are the two big challenges. We have this current crisis, energy cost of living crisis, and the scale, which is so massive, and where we're not really coming to terms with it as of right now. So what are some of the interventions and some of the tools that we can use to help do this and to help achieve this? Some of the ones that Elisabeth has already mentioned, I will sort of briefly pick up on because they are key, they're critically important. I think the first thing that was mentioned, or one of the first things that was mentioned, is disclosure and transparency. And it's important to have data to know what we invest in and what we don't invest in. One of the key things for the energy transition is that it's not just about building up renewables and low carbon, construction of something new. It's also the destruction of something that's already established. So we need to take money away from investments in fossil fuels and reassign that elsewhere. We tend to think about it only as investing in renewables and low carbon technologies, but we really need to go and take an axe to the entrenched interests and the money they still receive in terms of investment and subsidization, etc. So it's both of these things at the same time, and you only really know what's going on if you have transparency, if they disclose where investment is going, and we can make better decisions as to where the money should be going instead. There's also a lot of debate around taxonomy, and again, it's another issue that political issue that many of you will have picked up on. The EU green taxonomy has been passed. Well, there was an attempt in the European Parliament to prevent the taxonomy as it is from going forward, but now we have a taxonomy that includes gas and nuclear as green. Now, in all fairness, there are restrictions on what you can do with regards to gas. You have to have a plan to transition to renewables by 2035. You have to meet certain low thresholds of CO2 for your gas installations, but it is a lifeline, an extension of the lifeline, the industry. Nuclear is another question, but I'm not going to go into that now because it's a very big and very controversial topic. But taxonomy is important. We need to define what is sustainable, what is green and climate, and what isn't. And again, that's a question of construction and destruction of some of those existing arrangements. Flowing on from that, product standards and labeling. And the German regulators are very big on that. So there's also debate in the UK, of course, so we can avoid greenwashing. So we can actually verify compliance and look at what's really happening on the ground. One of the big criticisms of the GFANS initiative that Elisabeth mentioned last year at the COP, and I was there for the COP and when that was announced, and is that it's an exercise in greenwashing. We can't let a lot of these companies and investors get away with claiming they're doing things that are not actually happening. But having these standards and having, again, the transparency and labeling allows for independent external verification. But then there's other things that go beyond data, that go beyond transparency, taxonomy, establishing standards, and that's the government acting as an investor, co-investing. Germany has a futures fund now, which is a climate and transition fund, which has just been given an injection of 60 billion euros to co-invest into some of these early stage projects. It's really important. I think what governments often don't see is that the power they have to leverage private investment is much greater than what they're currently using, putting public money on the table, be it through development banks or through some of these funds, to actually bring in the private sector. Germany has a problem with venture capital. It's not a good place for venture. That's capital investment is partially because Germany has a particular structure of the economy, which is very Mittelstand focused, small and medium-sized enterprises. But most of the venture capital in Germany is US based. But if you do more around tax policy, if you create innovation hubs, for example, this is a lesson that you can learn from the French, for example, who identify key industries, strategic investment opportunities in climate, in sustainability, and help build supply chains around that, support these specific industries as champions, you can achieve a lot more. And that goes on from the early stages where venture capital is important to public-private partnerships, where again, Germany isn't doing very well. If you compare the amount in these spaces on PPP between the UK and Germany, in 2021 in Germany was 16 billion, in the UK is 160 billion. That's a very significant difference. So that leads us to an understanding where we see that Germany is focused a lot more on the public sector and public investment, whereas the UK is focused a lot more on unbundling some of that private investment, some of those private ideas and catalyzing that, which is important. So there's lessons to be learned here. The final one is around green bonds. I think that's a very important and growing field that many of you will have some understanding of or have read about or worked on. Germany only issued its first sovereign bond in 2020, 6.5 billion, heavily oversubscribed by a factor of 5, I believe it was. So that shows the appetite for sustainable investing. The country can do a lot more in the sovereign issuance of bonds, as can some of the subnational units of government, the Länder and the municipalities and others. So there are ways to transform and to help along private investment, to help catalyze that, as well as growing the share of public investment. The final point was around adaptation, and I said before that we don't tend to think around climate adaptation so much when we talk about energy system transitions and transformations, but the impacts of climate change on the energy system as well, and the system as a whole, really, not just the energy sector, are undeniably massive in Germany and in the UK and elsewhere. The floods just very recently, and the impact that has had financially and economically on large parts of the country, that requires more investment. And right now, adaptation is very small compared to mitigation investment. In Germany, in the UK, elsewhere around the world, we're struggling with mobilizing funds, and only about 2% of all of the investment adaptation comes from the private sector. So we need to do a lot more here to grow that pie and to use the money we do have more effectively. So there's a lot there that we can talk about. I want to stop here because it's a never-ending conversation, and hand it back to you, Heather. But a lot happening, a lot more to be done, open for discussion. Thank you.